Olá, boa tarde a todos. Eu sou o professor Monclar Lopes, docente de língua portuguesa do Departamento de Letras Clássicas e Vernáculas e professor do Programa de Pós-Graduação em Estudos da Linguagem da Universidade Federal Fluminense. E também pesquisador do CCO, Grupo de Pesquisa Conectivos e Conexão de Orações. Gostaria de, neste momento, cumprimentar a todos pela presença no nosso último dia de seminário, em especial a professora Elizabeth Traugott, que nos dará a grande honra de ouvi-la na tarde de hoje, e aos professores Ronice Miller de Quadros, docente da Universidade Federal de Santa Catarina, e Guilherme Lourenço, da Universidade Federal de Minas Gerais, que farão a tradução de inglês para Libras. Muito obrigado, Ronice e Guilherme, pela disponibilidade em nos auxiliar neste momento. Tenho a certeza de que todos que nos assistem conhecem ou pelo menos já ouviram falar de Traugott. Afinal, estamos diante de uma das maiores referências da linguística funcional, cujos textos têm sido fundamentais em nossas pesquisas. A esse respeito, nós do CCO, e abro parênteses aqui para falar também em nome dos pesquisadores do DIG e também dos demais pesquisadores brasileiros que desenvolvem e desenvolveram pesquisas no modelo linguístico funcional norte-americano, devemos muito a Traugott, uma vez que boa parte de nossas pesquisas são, em certa medida, também um fruto de seu árduo e competentíssimo trabalho. Embora a professora dispense apresentações, farei uma breve descrição de seu currículo, como é de praxe. Elizabeth Traugott é professora de Linguística e de Língua Inglesa na Universidade de Stanford, graduou-se como bacharel em Língua Inglesa na Universidade de Oxford, em 1960, e concluiu seu doutorado, também em Língua Inglesa, em 1964. Foi uma das pioneiras no estudo histórico da sintaxe gerativa, mas, insatisfeita com os modelos gerativos, desenvolveu, junto com Paul Hopper, uma abordagem funcional para a gramaticalização. Mais recentemente, em diálogo com os estudos da linguística cognitiva, produziu um novo modelo de análise junto com Graham Trousdale, da Universidade de Edimburgo, que possibilita o estudo histórico em perspectiva construcional. A obra Construccionalização e Mudanças Construcionais, 2013, agora recentemente traduzida para o português, é uma de nossas maiores referências até hoje, desde a data de sua publicação. Escolhi aqui apenas 2 obras de referência como ilustração, dentro de uma vasta produção competente da pesquisadora. Conforme consta na programação, a conferência da professora terá a duração de 1h30. Os minutos finais serão destinados às dúvidas. Sendo assim, caso tenha alguma pergunta ao longo da apresentação, você pode depositá-la no chat, seja em língua inglesa, seja em língua portuguesa, pois neste último caso faremos a tradução. Agora vou me dirigir à professora Traugott e peço licença a todos para alterar o idioma para a língua inglesa neste momento. So, good afternoon, Professor Traugott. We are really pleased to have you with us today. We would like to say that it's a great honor for our research group to listen to you this afternoon. So, now I invite Professor Elizabeth Traugott to start her talk, whose title is A Diachronic Constructionalist Framework for Analyzing the Development of Discourse Structuring Markers in English. Okay, so now it's with you, Professor.
Good afternoon.
Thank you. Good afternoon.
I very much appreciate the invitation to participate in this seminar. I appreciate your invitation and that of your colleagues and of the work that's being done signing and translating. I am sorry that I do not speak or understand Portuguese very well. However, I have looked at the abstracts and see that many of the presentations have been about construction grammar, a few about diachronic construction grammar, and some of them about mas, which is but in English, as I understand it, and that I am going to be talking about very briefly. I should say before I start that all of you linguists in Brazil have done an astonishing work all this last year in keeping linguistics alive. I'm enormously impressed, and so are all my colleagues worldwide. You have kept linguistics going at a time of pandemic and various other disasters, and it is a fabulous model for all of us. We really appreciate it. Okay, so to start, I have, could you change the slide, please? Thank you. I have recently been working on the development of discourse structuring markers in English, which I abbreviate as DSMs. They are connectives, and that's what makes them relevant, I hope, to your seminar. They are connectives like but, after all the same, by the way, instead. They are syntactically conjuncts, at least partially pragmatic, and used with the discourse function of cueing the relationship between two discourse segments, often clauses. I'm going to be talking more about that. So they combine discourse segment 1 with discourse segment 2 in what I call a D1, D2 formula that is paratactic. D1 and D2 do not have to be exactly adjacent, but they do have to be connectable. Fraser, in 1996, and many, many publications, as well as others like Schifrin and Haselow, have called them discourse markers. However, I find that this term covers a range of meaning that is somewhat troublesome. So I use the term DSM for the larger class of markers that cue the relationship of D2 to D1, some of which are relatively contentful and monofunctional, like instead and however, and restrict the term DM to the subset of highly pragmatic multifunctional markers like but, after all, and by the way, and I'm going to explain this more later. I'm going to be talking about the development of DSMs and the later use of some DSMs as DMs, and about how one might model these developments from the perspective of diachronic construction grammar, particularly the variety called constructionalization that Graham Trousdale, whose picture is there, and I discussed in 2013. I'm going to update some of our thinking, and 2013 is quite a while ago. So to achieve the objective that I have for this talk, I need several ingredients and a case study. Case study is brief history of but, conjunct DSM, that is a DM. I'm looking at only one conjunct because of time, but I will focus on characteristics that are, I believe, generalizable to other conjuncts and DSMs, and I hope they will be relevant to you in your work on conjunctions and connectives. So the outline is this. I'm going to start with the ingredients. What kind of construction grammar do I use? What is a useful model of a construction? What is diachronic construction grammar, especially the subtype constructionalization? And what is a discourse structuring marker? And then I will go on from what is probably more reminder to you than anything else, but necessary for outlining and providing a foundation for what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about historical constructionist perspective on the rise of DSMs. I'm going to discuss the continuum of DSMs that I already mentioned. Are there recurrent patterns of development of DSMs in English? And I want to emphasize that I'm very aware that what I'm talking about is some kinds of changes that have occurred repeatedly in English. At the end, I'm going to mention that it's fairly clear to me that Portuguese mas is a very different kind of conjunction connective from but in its history. I don't know the history of the Portuguese, but as far as I can tell, it's very different. So I'm going to give this brief case study of the history of but, which may or may not resemble at all the history of mas. And I'm going to ask the question, can default constructional templates be hypothesized for DSMs? And then I will conclude. First of all, what is construction grammar? As you know, there are many varieties, and they are discussed in Hoffman and Trousdale 2013, which is a handbook on construction grammar. Of course, 2013 is a while ago, and there have been further developments. I've based my work mainly on Goldberg, 1995 and 2006. And there she is in front of the Berlin gates. And some basic tenets, according to her, and I fully adopt these. Some basic tenets are, knowledge of language is knowledge of form-meaning pairings, and these form-meaning pairings are constructions or signs. Constructions are stored in a constructicon, a lexicon of constructions. And our knowledge of language is usage-based and derives from experience with language use. It is not innate or not totally innate. There may be some innate factors, but construction grammar is not interested in the innateness issue. Constructions are assembled. So, for example, did you hear that? Is by hypothesis an assembly of what we call micro-constructions, the individual constructions do, past tense, you, here, and a demonstrative pronoun. These are combined in a predicate construction, which could be subject here X or subject be X, subject verb X. An interrogative construction, the polo question, yes, no question, and the auxiliary inversion construction, which in English puts the auxiliary verb at the beginning. Did you hear that? Not heard you that. A very minimal way of representing a construction is this little formula here, form, meaning, with a symbolic link between them, and outside brackets, which show that it is a unit. I'm adopting this formalism from Boy of 2010. He was working on morphology. Constructions are said to be units or signs, and the representation with the outside brackets underscores the notion unit. But if the construction is a unit, it has to be understood as having internal structure. This is actually totally necessary for talking about change. A construction is an assembly of components, each one of which is subject to change. And I'm going to use Croft's model from 2001, his book, Radical Construction Grammar, where he suggests that within the unit of a construction, there is form that has at least three components, syntax, morphology, and phonology. And meaning also has at least three, semantics, pragmatics, and discourse function, which he understands as information structure. And I'm going to add a fourth, communicative function. Form and meaning are linked by a symbolic link, which can also change. And there is his model. Now, the outside box shows that we've got a construction which is a unit. And inside, there are two smaller boxes. One for form, with the three properties that I mentioned, syntactic, morphological, phonological, linked symbolically with meaning, again, three, semantic, pragmatic, and discourse function. Those components are not meant to be discrete, though obviously they look like it when they are presented that way. They have fuzzy boundaries and overlap. They are subject to change, as I mentioned. Key to the model that I just introduced is the word conventional. This is Croft's term, and it's very important. Conventional means shared in a community of speakers or writers. You will have noticed that in Croft's model is not only semantics, but also pragmatics that is conventional. Finkbeiner, in an issue of the journal Constructions and Frames in 2019, emphasized the importance of thinking about pragmatics as conventional. So we need to think of meaning as conventional, including pragmatics. And we also need to think of what counts as change. What counts as change involves conventionalization across speakers and writers of replicated innovations. Croft discusses that in 2001. Schmidt discusses it and elaborates on it in 2017. If you just have an innovation, we're innovating all the time. What matters for change is that these innovations are replicated and picked up by other interlocutors and speakers and writers. So moving on to what is diachronic construction grammar. Basically, it seeks to account for the development of constructions over time. Trousdale and I developed a particular variety of diachronic construction grammar that focuses on how to account for the rise of new constructions. That's our focus, and that's my focus today. We distinguish constructionalization, a term not coined by us, though many people say it is, but coined by Rostia in 2004. So we distinguish constructionalization and constructional changes, but said little about constructional changes. There have, rightly, been criticisms, and there have been developments in diachronic construction grammar because many people have worked on it. And since the book was written a long time ago, we do not necessarily agree with everything in it. I hope we don't. We have rethought the definitions of constructionalization and constructional changes, And Graham Trousdale presented a paper that we wrote at ISLE, International Society for Linguistics of English, earlier this summer. And we have redefined constructionalization and constructional changes. This is our new idea. Constructionalization is the establishment of a new symbolic link between form and meaning, which has been replicated across a network of language users and which involves an addition to the constructicon. Establishment of a new link is meant to invoke conventionalization. Replication across a network of language users also invokes conventionalization across different speakers and involves an addition to the constructicon, suggests that a new construction is a new unit of knowledge. Constructional changes are modulations of contextual uses prior to and following constructionalization. They do not involve additions to the constructicon. They're not new words, not new constructions, but variants of them. Now, as I said, we didn't say very much in our book about constructional changes. And as we've worked on constructionalization and constructional changes, we have become aware that pre-constructional constructional changes tend to be rather different from post-constructional constructional changes. Pre-constructionalization, they tend to be accumulations and assemblies of contextual uses, which can be quite loosely connected, and Butts and Petre have shown this for the development of be going to and various other constructions. They are loosely connected contexts in which a potentially changing construction is used. One of the loosely connected contexts is a context of comments about talk. This was pointed out by Lenker 2010, looking at adverbial connectors in the history of early modern English primarily, but in the history of English in general. Now, the context of a comment about talk may not be immediately adjacent. It can be at some distance, like 2 or 3 clauses back. This is what some Petre is talking about. The context doesn't have to be local and immediate. However, post-constructional changes tend to be local. For example, the expansion of the construction to new immediate contexts. The term host class expansion was development for this kind of change by Himmelmann in 2004, thinking about grammaticalization. This is what Hilpert, 2008, also talking about grammaticalization and constructionalization, called colexemic associations. And he's developed that very extensively in his 2013 book. An example of connective is by the way, which meant originally in passing as a footnote. By the way, I observe X. It was originally used in statements, and over time it came to be used with directives. It's an example of expansion of the construction to new kinds of immediate contexts. Now, our approach is clearly qualitative. Hilbert has developed a quantitative approach, which is well represented in his 2013 book and in everything that he's written since then, pretty much. Now, there's an increasing tendency among quantitative constructionalists, for example, Desmet, Hilbert, Petre, to think of language as emergent in the sense of Hopper, 1987. It's always provisional and it's never stable. I think this is the outcome of working quantitatively, because you're looking at every possible kind of context and how it changes. It's a very micro analysis. However, in my view, and that of Graham Trousdale, there must be some stability. Otherwise, we would not understand puns or such expressions as but me no buts. To understand that, we have to conventionally understand that but has a negative in it. It's not the logical but that means it's the same thing as and. It is a but that has an implicature of negation in it. We got to know that, just to understand a pun. So our view, Graham's and mine, is that we need a qualitative or quantitative approach that recognizes language as emerging, not emergent. There's an interesting discussion of the distinction between emergent and emerging by Hopper himself in 2011 in the Auer and Fender book of 2011. Emergent grammar is unstable, eternally emerging, there's nothing fixed. Emerging perspective says that patterns can be stable, but are subject to shifts over time. They're stable, but they're also dynamic. And I have found that Croft's model, which I presented earlier, provides a useful model for accounting for emerging grammar. I have stopped to talk about that because I think there's sometimes some misunderstandings about what the objectives are or should be. And I want to be very clear that in thinking about constructionalization, we're thinking about emerging dynamic shifts over time with some stability. Now, Croft's model favors generalizations and abstractions from fine details. It can be used to account for what Goldberg in 2019 calls lossy memory. Not all information that is experienced is retained, but some abstraction over contextual encounters leads to a representation that can be strengthened or weakened. I debated whether to introduce Goldberg's idea here because, as Hilbert has rightly pointed out, when we do historical work, we have no immediate access to what's going on in people's minds in the past. Cannot reconstruct minds or what happened there. Nevertheless, I think it's useful to think of that model, that Croft model, as something that will, in fact, account, as I said, for experience that is retained and some abstraction, and contextual encounters lead to representations that can be strengthened or weakened. That is very fundamental to the way I think about constructional change. So, one more ingredient necessary. What is discourse structuring marker? Discourse structuring markers are connectives of various functional types. Fraser lists 12 in his 1996 paper. Elaboratives, did I say 12? 4. 4 in his 1996 paper. There are elaborators, like also and further, in addition, moreover, plus. Contrastives, like but, all the same instead. Digressives, like by the same way, by the way, and incidentally. And inferentials, like after all, so, and then. All of them combine clauses paratactically. That is, they signal roughly coordinate equal status between D1 and D2. They exclude subordinators, in other words. They all have textual function in the sense of Halliday and Hassan. That is, they combine pieces of text. That's another way of saying they combine D1 and D2, discourse segment 1 and discourse segment 2. I call them discourse structuring markers as opposed to discourse structure markers to highlight the fact that they are used by speakers and writers not just to reflect connective relations, but also to create them in the process of speakers and writers negotiating meaning with addressees and readers. The discourse structure ring in that they are used to do work of cueing relationships. They typically occur in clause initial position. So as a DSM, and occurs only there in an initial position. However, some, like all the same, are preferred in clause final position. But it still links. It links and says, despite what you just might have thought. Some DSMs may occur in several positions. For example, after all, and by the way, where they have different functions, particularly after all. In 21st century English, these distinctions are weakening. But around 1900, there were very, very clear distinctions, use of after all in different positions. Initially, after all, they got married. Here you're justifying something. He is, after all, the president. Here, this is medial, and it justifies D1. It emphasizes he's the president and reminds the addressee that he's the president. And C, he became president after all, concedes that this wasn't expected. So 3 different meanings and 3 different positions, 3 different functions of after all. Now, not all of them in English are as multifunctional as that. By the way, is not as multifunctional, though it occurs in all 3 positions. I just mentioned this as a possibility for the characterization of DSMs. They can occur in different positions, and if they occur in different positions, they may have different functions. And this may change over time. I mentioned earlier that there's a continuum of discourse structuring markers. So there's a continuum of expressions of connectivity from those that are highly lexical, like, to return to my topic, these are connectives that Cuenca in 2015 called lexical connectives. to semi-lexical, partially pragmatic, monofunctional connectives like in addition, which mean exactly the same thing wherever you put it in a sentence, to highly pragmatic and multifunctional ones like but and after all. But only occurs in standard English in initial position, but it can mean many, very different things, as has been discussed by many people. And after all, as I just mentioned, can occur in different places and mean different things. Now, I'm not including the highly lexical type in my continuum because I'm interested in those that are used with some degree of pragmaticity and non-representation. Things that are not fully contentful and that are partially pragmatic. I call type B the ones that are semi-lexical and partially pragmatic 1 DSMs. And I call type C those that are highly pragmatic and multifunctional DMs. So I have a very restrictive definition of DMs. It's more restrictive by far than phrases. It's a subset of his DMs. So here's the continuum. On the left, you have these 1 DSMs, which are partially contentful, monofunctional, like further and instead. And DMs on the right, on the other end of the pole, which are largely pragmatic, multifunctional, for example, but, by the way, and after all. And some, in present-day English, are somewhere in between, like incidentally, which is coming to be more pragmatic than it was in the 19th or even 20th century. And of course, since, as I will show, 1 DSMs become DMs and not the other way around, in history, anything that becomes a DM will go through a stage of being partially contentful. And there's a shift in the degree of contentfulness to greater pragmaticness. So historically in English, DMs arise out of 1 DSMs, and 1 DSMs in English typically arise out of circumstance adverbials. I've studied the development of a number of discourse structuring markers, elaborators, contrastives, digressives, and inferentials. And in English, most derive from circumstance adverbials. From spatials, that's the most frequent source, but further, instead, by the way, are examples. Some derive from temporal adverbials, like now and then, and some from manner adverbials, like also, which meant exactly so, exactly in this way, and incidentally. I have mentioned one that has its source in the adjectival phrase, all the same. Means it used to mean, and still does mean, exactly the same, but has come to be used as a concessive despite that. And it's an outlier in this typology because adjectival phrases are very rare as sources in English of discourse structuring markers. By hypothesis, an adverbial phrase can come to be reinterpreted as a conjunct DSM construction, especially when used in clause initial position. Here, the adverbial phrase can be topicalized and used to frame the upcoming predicate. It's typical in English of adverbials that they can be used in initial position, topicalized. Traugott and Sarda give this example. In Greece, farmers expect disaster should there be no rain next year. In France, the drought has been the worst on record. So you have in Greece at the beginning and in France at the beginning. Here, they're topicalized and they're used to frame what is said. You could say, these are in an abnormal position. Because normally in English, if you're not topicalizing, you would say, farmers expect disaster in Greece, should there be no rain. They'd correct it at the end. But here it is, in initial position to frame the upcoming predicate. It would be disaster if there's no rain. Traugott and Sarda point out that framing adverbials delimit discourse segments that are cohesive with the interpretive criteria they set up. This is what DSMs do. Discourse structuring markers are cohesive with the interpretive criteria that they set up. And that's why I use that term, structuring. They set up, or they are used to set up interpretive criteria. However, unlike adverbials, circumstance adverbials, they're not syntactically integrated with a clause in the way that framing adverbials are, nor do they have the same stress pattern. Now, to summarize this, in a preliminary way, I have this little model here, circumstance adverbial, circ-ad, which is contentful and monofunctional. In the context of topicalized assemblies, and topicalization and assemblies of context, can become a conjunct, which is partially contentful, partially pragmatic, and a DSM. Now, I said contexts appear in Apple Chancery font, but the font has disappeared in the switching of the platform. But it doesn't matter because the context is there at the bottom, in between the two stages. So this model represents constructionalization. There's been a change in form. The circumstance adverb is now used as a conjunct, and in meaning and function, it is now a DSM. This results in a new member of the constructicon. These are what most dictionaries would think of as homonyms. They have the same form, but they have a different function and different meaning. Occasionally, a monofunctional DSM comes to be used multifunctionally as a DM, for example, but, by the way, and after all, and that is a constructional change. This does not result in a new member of the constructicon. So I distinguish monofunctional DSMs, I call them 1DSMs, and multifunctional DSMs, I call them DMs. And the discourse structuring markers trajectory hypothesis now includes an optional further step of circumstance adverb to 1DSM, we've done that, and optionally to DM. And that is here. Again, the contexts are down the bottom. The first part is the same, the circumstance adverb becoming the conjunct when the circumstance adverb is topicalized and when there are appropriate assemblies of context. It's the third part, the right-hand box, that is new. You've noticed that the contexts are said to be largely local. I've discussed that before. They happen to be very closely adjacent. And now what we have is a conjunct that is largely pragmatic and a DM. Now let's look at but for a moment. But has been studied at length. I'm not saying anything new about but. What I hope will be new about it is the model, using the constructional model that Profª drew up. So but is multifunctional. It's a DM in present-day English, and it's used to signal that D2 presents a contrast of some sort to D1. So it's a contrastive connective. Fraser points out that contrast may be explicit, and this is his example. John liked to dance, but I like to read. And here the subjects are contrasted, John and I. Or it may be, the contrast may be implicit. We started late, but we will arrive on time. We started late implicates late arrival. You have to infer from we started late that you might be not arrive on time. The implicature is contrasted and cancelled by arrive on time. Falling but. Functions in but include objection, topic shift, self-correction, correction of others, as Schifrin pointed out in 1987. Pragmatically, there's almost always some element of D2 being outside of what might be considered to be directly coherent with D1 or directly inferred from it. But occasionally, but is so weak that it could be interpreted as an elaborative connective, close in meaning to and. And Fraser gives this example in 5. A says, I had a lovely evening last night with Harry, and B, the interlocutor, said, but did he repay you the money? Where but doesn't contrast anything in A that A has said, just introduces something that is not fully coherent and will not work very well there. But it does seem to be elaborative. So what's its history? In Old English, which is about 650 of the Common Era to 1150, the basic contrastive discourse marker was ak. The source of but in Old English is bouton, outside of. It's a spatial preposition or an adverbial. It's a circumstance adverbial. I'm not going to read this whole example for lack of time, but essentially it's saying that the fort was broken into, there was great slaughter of people, of the Northumbrians. Sume binan, some inside, sume bouton, some outside. That's the bouton source of but. So they're outside. It was used abstractly and metaphorically to mean except in later Old English. In 7, we have an example of, we're talking about an emperor who ravaged continents from the Red Sea to Asia over 50 years and was obviously very busy going from one continent to another. Utan dem, operated for med miklum gefechtum on Syria by Northland, except that he often went with large battles into Syria. Its clause initial, Butantan, and going to Syria often was outside of his set of infrequent, far-sweeping contexts. And notice that Bhutan then is clause initial in 7. And Nevalanian in 1990 associates the except use mainly with contexts such as alle Bhutan anum, all except one, where one is outside the set, and negative statements. You get both in 8. Some men said that den Bhutan tweeëndertig, Asia and over Europa. Some men said that not were, you could do that in Old English, not were, except, not were. So there wasn't anything except 2 parts, Asia and Europe. There are no 2 parts of the world, Asia and Europe, where Bhutan means except. So we have a spatial adverbial PP used in an assembly of contexts, abstract metaphorical reference, local phrases like elam Bhutan anum, and negation. Well, it doesn't mean but, it means except or outside. Abstract clausal contexts came to be used more frequently in Middle English, which is around 1150 to 1500. This led to the rise of a contrastive 1 DSM, but usually used in direct contrasts. And negative contexts came to be used less frequently. I think we can think of that as a case of negative absorption, which is very well known. People talk a lot about Jesperson's cycle. The famous example is French ne pas, becoming also pas. So it's ne is the negative, ne pas is not a step, and the pas step in colloquial French is the only negator. Negative came to be an implicature of but by the end of Middle English. In Middle English, use of but as a contrastive connective instead of earlier ak increased. And during later Middle English, 1300 on, connective but came to be used less and less in negative contexts, more and more in indirect contexts, and with more and more nuanced meanings. That is host class expansion. And all of that led to the rise around 1550 of a multifunctional discourse marker, which could be used with several pragmatic different meanings. And I've summarized that here. I see not only that the font got changed, but loss somehow migrated. So what you need to look at here, the essential part is, we start out with a prepositional phrase, which means outside of MP, and it's exclusive, it's location. In topicalized contexts, around 1200, it came to be used as except MP with a scalar function. In various assemblies of contexts, around 1300, it became a conjunct, a connector that contrasted D1 and D2. And it's a 1 DSM. And in contexts of loss of contrast and various new assemblies, it became around 1500 a negative indirect contrastive and a DM. But I'm afraid some of that got lost in transition there. It's simply summarized what I said before. And the 20th century development, which I won't get into for lack of time, is something that you may have heard about, that in the 20th century, there's a new concessive use Although it was first noticed in Australian English, but has been shown to not be limited to Australian English. Now skip the next example. Could we please move on? Okay, I'm skipping that example. You can read it. It's a final but. And moving on. We're moving to discussion. The changes from the meaning outside to exclusion and the contextual shifts within which this occurred are preconstructionalizations. The shift from prepositional phrase to conjunct with concomitant shift to contrastive meaning is a constructionalization. And the shift from the one DSM use of but to the DM use of but in the 16th century is post-constructional change. And so is the 20th century use in clause final position. And the model, had it not fallen apart, shows the constructional change distinction well. All DSMs in English derive from non-connective sources. Use of a non-connective as a DSM is a textual change as well as a constructionalization. So the DSM serves to combine clauses. It's also a weak case of subjectification because the speaker-writer chooses how to relate D2 to D1. And connective but is more speaker-oriented and less physically, objectively verifiable than outside. It is a case of weak intersubjectification as well because the connective is procedural and cues the addressee reader to the intended relationship between D2 and D1. Some time ago, a long time ago, I hypothesized that there was a linear semantic trajectory from subjective to textual to expressive and intersubjective. That hypothesis has been much debated. Kesquier in 2010 almost exploded it, and Narog in 2014 proposed instead that you might start with subjectification, optional, then have intersubjectification, and then text and discourse orientation. But this whole project of trying to linearize subjectivity, expressivity, and textuality, and subjectification, intersubjectification, and the development of discourse orientation is the product of grammaticalization thinking and the search for unidirectionality, which I was quite involved in 1982. And Kesquier and Narog are also interested in the grammaticalization hypothesis. We don't need unidirectionality in construction grammar or constructionalization. In the case of constructionalization of the discourse structuring markers, all three changes can be hypothesized to occur simultaneously and by default. I propose to give the name communicative function, or CF, to these three properties: weakly subjective, weakly intersubjective, and textual. Of course, these are not properties of all constructions. Ditransitives are not particularly textual, but they are criteria for discourse structuring markers. So I propose that when there is constructionalization of a circumstance adverbial as a conjunct DSM, the new DSM acquires or inherits the following properties from an abstract connective schema. The proposal is that when something comes to be constructionalized as a discourse structuring marker or a connector, it gets conjunct syntax. It loses much of the original semantics, so it's blank there. It becomes a connector, pragmatically, that's partially contentful and partially pragmatic. It becomes a 1DSM. It also acquires a slightly weakly subjective and slightly weakly intersubjective and, of course, textual meaning. All of those things I'm proposing happen at the same time when something, in English at least, is constructionalized as a discourse structuring marker. So by way of conclusion, I hope to have shown that a historical constructionist approach allows us to focus on change in both form and meaning, both form and meaning, not mainly one or the other, as has been customary in work on grammaticalization. Of course, those working on grammaticalization have always recognized there's form and meaning. That's obvious. But when we did the work, we either focused on form, like Lehmann, or we focused on meaning, like Heine and his colleagues and myself. So historical constructionist approach not only allows us to focus on changes of both form and meaning, it orients us to contextual modulations, especially contextual assemblies, and it provides a model of change that qualitatively accounts for broad outlines of observed data and can be supplemented, of course, quantitatively. Much remains to be done. One could investigate how the history of a particular discourse structuring marker is linked to the history of others in the same, quote, constructional space, so the same local schema, and how this changes over time. Hilpert has a chapter in his 2013 book studying the changing relationships between uses of concessive subordinators, although, though, while, and if. Well, you could do that with contrastive in English and contrastive, paratactic. Contrastive set would be, but all the same, even so, however, instead, on the other hand, still, and yet. One could also investigate how the history of a discourse structuring marker is linked to different areas of constructional space, so external schemas. In the case of but, there's overlap, as I mentioned, in some contexts and in some periods, with elaboratives like and, scalar markers like only, exceptive markers like except. And one can ask, are these overlaps similar in other languages? And here, though I must admit ignorance about the development of Portuguese mas, I understand from the internet that both Portuguese mas and French mais are derived from the Latin maior, which means greater. And that presumably means that originally it was elaborative. However, Spanish perro comes from per hoc by this, which is presumably inferential. You know those histories, I don't. But just pointing out, it is rather interesting that the Portuguese mas is rather like all the same. It comes from adjective rather than from a circumstance adverbial, as far as I understand it. So answers to such questions give insight into shifts in cognitive and in cognition and differences in cultural knowledge. The main source of discourse structuring markers in English, as I have said, is adverbial. What are the main sources in other languages? As I said, the source of Portuguese mas appears to be adjectival? And what are the sources of other discourse structuring markers in Portuguese? It would be good to know what the prosodic changes are that accompany the rise of discourse structuring markers. Unfortunately, the historical record does not show us prosody or gesture, and construction grammar has had little to say about either of them. However, things are changing. How to study prosody in construction grammar terms and how to model it will hopefully arise out of work such as Alm and Fischer and Gras and Elvira. And how to study change in gesture will hopefully arise out of work by Wilcox and Okino. But as I say, unfortunately, we do not have direct access to either prosody or gesture in historical texts long ago. Now, obviously, we do when we're looking at language change in progress, but that doesn't go far back. I think it's now time to thank you for your attention and to invite questions, comments, and challenges. I really appreciate challenge because that's what makes one think, and that's what makes research happen. So feel free to argue. That's good.
So thank you for your excellent speech, Professor Traugott. Reading your text and also listening to you is always a great opportunity for learning more about language change through a usage-based perspective. Now we have 5 questions from the audience. Okay, so I will address them to you. The first one is from Maria Angela. Can we interpret discursive markers as a subclass of connectors, or, on the other hand, as a more advanced category at the pragmatic level of the language derived from connection strategies?
Yes, let's see if I remember all of that. Discourse markers are a subset. Discourse structuring markers are a subset of connectors. I mentioned Cuenca's lexical connectors and said I was excluding them because my interest, which I didn't really have time to elaborate on, is my interest is in introducing more pragmatics into construction grammar and particularly into constructionalization work. Now, the second part of the question was, are discourse structuring markers more advanced? They are more pragmatic. I would be a little nervous these days in talking about advanced because that term makes it sound like maybe it's better in some kind of way, but I would say it is definitely more pragmatic, yes. My point about the continuum was that we start out with relatively contentful, not very pragmatic markers, and they can become, over time, much more pragmatic and less contentful. And then I call them the ends. So yes, thank you for that question. Clarification, very good. I've lost you.
Sorry, my microphone was off. So the next question is mine. It's related somehow to the first one made by Maria Angela. So as discursive markers are highly pragmatic and multifunctional, can we conclude that they are never semanticized despite being conventional?
Well, yeah, this is a terminological problem, and it's a valuable question. I think there has been a tendency, encouraged by myself, I will admit, that change has been thought of in terms of semantics. I would say that discourse markers become more pragmatic. And by that, I mean they are more contextually dependent, though they do have conventional meanings of their own. I would not connect conventionalization with semanticization, because conventionalization to me simply means it has come to be recognized by various speakers. Now, there's a tradition of separating semantics and pragmatics, where pragmatics is not conventional at all. Finkbeiner talks about this at great extent in the article that I mentioned. The traditional view of pragmatics is that it's totally context dependent. Her point, and that of Yesholt and others who have discussed this, and I would assume also Croft, because he puts pragmatics in the conventional part, the claim about conventionalization is that there's shared knowledge. So even though but is used pragmatically in many kinds of ways, you and I and any other speaker of English knows that but somehow negates what precedes. You and I and any other speaker of English knows that all the same, used in a certain way, implicates and says, despite what has just been said. It's conventionalized simply means what we all know, what we share, the shared knowledge. It's cultural shared, shared by individuals, shared across a group of speakers. Now, there's always an argument about what a group of speakers might be. That is necessarily defined by the kinds of work one does, collecting various kinds of corpus evidence or going out in the field, but you never get everybody's knowledge, and not everybody's knowledge is going to be the same. This is why, as is very well known, we don't always understand each other. And we read things into the use of connectives that were not intended, because not everybody shared it. So conventionalization and semanticization, no, they're not the same.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so the next one is from Ana Cláudia. In one of your slides, there is an interesting schematic representation for the diachronic trajectory of DMs on a constructionalist perspective. Is there any text where we could have access to this representation?
Currently, no, I don't think so. It's there in the forthcoming books that I referred to. You're welcome, if you want to cite it to argue with it or use it, or just cite this particular presentation. But no, I don't think it has appeared in print yet.
Okay, so the next one is related to this. On the slide 40, you show the change trajectory of but in the representation in the 13th century. But was already a conjunction and continues being one in the 15th. So I think that there is another part. I was curious to know why there is a new knot in the representation for the 15th century, since that would imply a new knot. Wouldn't it be a case of constructional change, that is, of polysemy only?
Well, let me see. That model unfortunately got rather messed up.
Slide 40.
All right. What we're talking about is the shift from 1,000 to 1,200, so 1,200. The shift is except NP and it's scalar. That is a constructional change. The first change is a constructional change.
Okay.
Now the second one, to conjunct connected contrastive D1, D2, 1 DSM of contrast, that is a constructionalization, and I'm afraid that became rather unclear because things started to get squeezed together, and it's very hard to do these things when cross platforms. But the idea is that there was a constructionalization around 1300 when the conjunct use came into being, and it's preceded by a constructional change which involved the meaning except. Now, you will have noticed probably that there is a change in phonology. I think I mentioned that the change in phonology is a systemic change. Graham and I are thinking a lot about how to deal with these systemic changes, but we don't regard that as a particular, as evidence for the development of a new node or a new construction, because every disyllabic word in English with a weak ending in un ended up without it. So the verb to ride in English was a redone in Old English. To ride was a redone. The AN disappeared. We still have E in spelling, but we don't pronounce it. Every single disyllabic word in English. Pretty much, I mean, for anything you say, there's always an exception somewhere. But one could say, in general, it doesn't matter whether it's a connective or a verb or a noun or anything. If it's got a weak inflection, spelled EN at that period, it simply disappeared. Likewise, in various kinds of standard English, Southern Standard English, short U became A, which is what I have for around 1300. In fact, it might be a bit later, but that shift from but to but did not occur in Scotland. You can still say but in Scotland. Or Northern English, it didn't occur. So what I have here is Standard English. Again, there's a question about whether these dialect differences should be accounted for as cases of constructionalization. I don't think so, because I don't think whether you pronounce it but or but makes any difference to your lexicon. You still have one contrastive discourse structuring marker, which is now a discourse marker. I don't know, did that answer the question? I think I lost track. Whether there's a new representation in the 15th century. since that would apply only, no. Well, if you're referring to the DM, in the 15th century, I don't have one that's 15th century, I have one that's 16th century. The DM, if the question is about the new DM, I treat that as a constructional change, not a constructional change, because there was no syntactic change, there was no morphological change, there was no phonological change. It simply is a new, more pragmatic use of an extant item that's in the constructicon. That is the intention there. I mean, is it a polysemy? Yes, it is a polysemy only.
Okay. Okay, so there are more two questions. The next one is from Mariangela again. Can the weak intersubjectivity of discursive markers be interpreted as a consequence of the conventionalization of these constituents in the constructicon?
The fact that it's weak is meant in a more elaborate version of what I talked about to indicate that any discourse structuring marker, any connective, is a procedural. And a procedural is meant to cue the addressee of the relationship. So, by definition, anything that's procedural is going to be weakly intersubjective. It's not something that happens later. Now you get stronger intersubjectivity in some cases. I've looked at by the way. By the way used to be by the wayside along the road, en route. Talking en route came to be used as a metaphor in passing, I will say. In my argument, I will say this or that. It came to be a discourse marker of a kind of dismissive, not really, what's coming up is not really important. And that was used enough to be conceived as, in fact, false. So there's a lot of change of intersubjectification in the history of by the way, which came to be used as a hedge on some upcoming thing. There's a directive to do something or case threatening D2. And then it came to be extremely aggressive. And that's an intersubjectification in combination with oh. So, oh, by the way, can be nice. Oh, by the way, I got some candy for you. And oh, by the way, can be extremely aggressive and say, oh, by the way, you failed this, that, and the other. I mean, I've written at length about this. It's the stages of intersubjectivity, one after another, with by the way. Now, they're not with but, to my knowledge. Though I think when you have a concessive final but, the Thompson and Mueller, oh, sorry, no, that's wrong. I'm sorry, I'm bluffing on the Mulder. Thompson and Mulder. Final but as a concessive. A concessive is probably even more intersubjective than a non-concessive but, because it invites you to imagine all kinds of despite this, that relationships. And how is it that you are combining these two things? You have to do that for but. But when you have a concessive but, despite what I've just said, or what you might think, that I think requires more attention from the addressee. So it might be more intersubjective. One would have to do some psycholinguistic work, I think, to provide evidence for that. It's just an intuition that the consensus is more intersubjective. So even Butt might have acquired more intersubjectivity. I know, by the way, did. I mean, it's very, very clear in the cohort data that it gets more and more and more intersubjective over time.
Okay, so now there is the last one. It's from Vitor Luis. Considering the perspective that language is gradient, how can we attest to the exact moment of constructionalization?
I don't seek to. That's a question that was raised by Burrs and company, and has been raised about constructionalization. Now, my maybe hidden point about using the craft model and saying it deals with abstractions and the definition that talks about conventionalization says there isn't an exact moment of constructionalization. What it says is there is a relative time in which people started using a particular construction in similar ways. So I would not say that the first instance of anything is a change. I will simply say it's the first instance in our corpus, of course not among speakers of the language, but not recorded. But in our corpus, this is a first example. But I have to look for more examples to provide evidence of conventionalization, sharing by other writers, in the case of the work I do, but other speakers and writers. And so exact moment of constructionalization is not relevant because it is only relevant, in my view, and also Graham's, to innovation. And how you could ever tell from textual evidence of the exact moment of an innovation, I don't know, because there are probably writers who are not represented in our corpus, and there are no doubt many, many speakers are not represented in writing. So you could only tell the exact moment of anything in possibly some contemporary group of speakers. However, since we don't have every speaker, I don't think it's possible to find an exact moment of an innovation anywhere for anything. And that's my thought about that question. And it's an important question. They've all been very important questions, good questions. But if language is gradient, yes, language is gradient, and there's more and more and more across speakers. I mean, the people who work on individual speakers and their effect on change, like, for example, Petre, and what they're looking at is how individual speakers, some of them use something more frequently over time, and some of them don't. They innovate something and maybe they won't use it again in the record that we have. But of course, we don't have the whole record of what Pepys or anybody else said. All we have is his diaries. So it's what's represented there. So yes, you can find a moment at which somebody said something But the gradients is in how frequently they say it and to what extent does it get transmitted, replicated across speakers. And that has to be an approximation, simply because of the nature of our data.
Okay, so thank you, Professor Traugott. I have some messages of compliments here. Okay, Clécia Reis said, such an amazing speech. Nilza Barroso, thanks, Professor Traugott, good to see you. Professora Ana Cláudia, thank you so much, Professor Elizabeth Traugott. Gabriela Conceição, you are so amazing, thank you for excellent conference. Camila Fontes, what a privilege. So people are really pleased to hear you today. So thank you once more, Professor Traugott. It was a great pleasure and also a great honor to hear you this afternoon.
Well, thank you for those comments. That's very appreciative of those comments. And I'm very appreciative of your questions because they're all of them important and they all require further thought and explanation. So, yes, thank you. So have a good rest of the day.
Yes.
Thank you very much. Okay.
So do you. Okay, so thank you. So bye-bye, Professor Traugott.
And we stayed connected. That's amazing.
Okay.
And the society has gone out here. We're going to be out for the rest of the day.
Everything was fine.
Bye.
Ok, bye-bye.
Bye.
Ok. Agora eu convido o professor Ivo de volta à reunião. De volta não, pela primeira vez, né? Ele não estava aqui. Para dar uns recados finais.
Ok, muito obrigado, Monclar, pela condução da nossa última atividade. Na verdade, eu estou entrando aqui apenas para fazer os agradecimentos finais, né? Chegamos ao final do terceiro seminário do Grupo de Pesquisa Conectivos e Conexão de Orações. Tivemos aqui 2 palestras, conferências excepcionais, com a presença do professor Mário Perini, hoje pela manhã, e agora, fechando com chave de ouro, a professora Elizabeth Traugott, que é talvez a maior referência dos estudos funcionalistas, com abordagens muito instigantes. Quero também agradecer os professores da mesa redonda, o Márcio Leitão, da Federal da Paraíba, a professora Sanderleia, da Unesp, a todos os coordenadores de simpósio que aceitaram o nosso convite, também os coordenadores das comunicações coordenadas, trabalhos muito bons. Agradecer aos meus colegas do CCO, professores Milena, que é a vice-líder, Ana Beatriz, Ana Cláudia, Ana Paula, professor Monclar e professor Tarles. Agradecer muito a todos os alunos do CCO, doutorandos, mestrandos, alunos de iniciação científica, alunos que já são doutores, né? Outros que são aspirantes, que estão desejando entrar no mestrado. Agradecer muito a participação de todos vocês que nos assistiram, que acompanharam, que acreditaram em nosso evento, que nos prestigiaram, pessoas de todas as regiões do Brasil e também algumas pessoas do exterior. Muito obrigado pela credibilidade. Dizer também que esse terceiro seminário deu um passo na inclusão, que é um desafio, é difícil, mas nós conseguimos aqui garantir intérprete de Libras para grande parte das atividades. Um agradecimento especialíssimo à professora Ronice Quadros e ao professor Guilherme Lourenço, que estiveram aqui agora há pouco, fazendo, né, a tradução de inglês para Libras. Então, esse é um compromisso nosso também, de que o nosso grupo seja cada vez mais inclusivo. Agradecimento especial à Universidade Federal Fluminense, né, a nossa universidade, que apoia, né, as nossas atividades acadêmicas, ao Instituto de Letras, à direção, ao programa de pós-graduação em Estudos de Linguagem, professora Silmara, a nossa coordenadora. Enfim, agradecimento a todos, né? E se eu esqueço de alguém, eu já peço desculpas de antemão. E os certificados serão enviados em até 20 dias. Todos aqueles que apresentaram trabalhos poderão fazer suas publicações em anais, indexado. A partir do dia 20 de novembro é possível mandar os seus textos. É só consultar o nosso site do CCO. E desde já quero convidar todos para o 4º seminário do CCO. O que é bom tem que permanecer, né? Então, daqui a 2 anos, em 2023, né, se Deus quiser, de modo presencial, lá no Instituto de Letras, no belo Instituto de Letras da UF, nós esperamos todos vocês para o nosso 4º seminário do CCO. Acompanhe nossas redes sociais, nosso site. Nós estamos sempre divulgando novidades, eventos, porque nós temos compromisso para romper com essas trevas da ignorância que insistem, né, em destruir o nosso país. Nós vamos lutar até o fim por educação, por ciência, por pesquisa e tecnologia. Nós vamos resistir, porque resistir é preciso. Nós vamos salvar o nosso país. Um grande abraço a todos e até os próximos eventos. Um abraço.